Before I introduce our speaker, let me invite those of you in the back, if you'd like a better view, you can move up. We have a few seats in the front row. And our technical staff has informed me that even at a scintillating talk like this, the screens are not radioactive, so it's safe to. We do have a couple of Sanskritists in the front row, which may seem unsafe, but I can assure you that being a Sanskritist these days is a condition not nearly as contagious as it ought to be, so it's fairly safe to sit in the front. As the faculty director here at the University of Chicago Center in Delhi, I have the pleasure of welcoming you all here this evening to what is, I believe, our last major event of the year, and actually sort of a Christmas present for many of us. Certainly for me personally, I feel a special kinship to our distinguished speaker this evening because he was quite recently, actually up until just a few months ago, the academic director at the University of Chicago Center in Paris, which has served as one of the early models for this center here. The Paris Center recently celebrated, I think, its 10th anniversary. And this center opened up only in March, so we need all of the guidance that we can get. And tonight's speaker has been helpful in that connection, and also, obligingly enough, given these international connections, is speaking this evening on a topic of interest in terms of globalization in the international scene. Our speaker this evening is Salikoko Mufwene, who is the Frank J. McLaurin Distinguished Service Professor of Linguistics and the College in Chicago, also a professor in the Committee of Evolutionary Biology and a professor in the Committee on the Conceptual and Historical Studies of Science, all of these at the University of Chicago. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1979 and has been at the university since 1992. And over the past 20 years, his research has been primarily on morphosyntactic and semantic characteristics of Gala, African American vernacular English, Jamaican Creole, and English. But in recent years, he has focused more on the development of Atlantic Creoles, lexified by European languages, Kikongo, Kituba, Lingala, and on questions of language evolution. Professor Mufwene has authored numerous publications, many of which are available for download, and he has also innovated several new classes at the University of Chicago. And you can see a very interesting list of the courses that he's taught recently on his webpage, which you can reach through the university webpage. And so rather than give you more information about him tonight, I will instead direct your well-invested attention to our speaker himself, Salikoko Mufwene.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gary, for that wonderful and generous introduction. For my audience, I may stumble on my words today because for the past 36 hours I have slept very little. I saved the University of Chicago some money because flying through Istanbul to Delhi was half the price that I would have paid compared to flying from Cape Town direct to Delhi. $4,000 versus $1,900. So I am a responsible citizen of the university. And what I'm going to present today, first of all, I'm very happy to be here. It's really a pleasure to be among probably the first University of Chicago professors to speak at the center. And what I'm going to do, I chose a topic that overlaps with what I'm going to talk about in my keynote address tomorrow at the conference of the International Association of World Englishes. There, the title that I chose is a provocative one: How India too made English a world language. That's the kind of thing that those of us that come from former colonies don't usually talk about, because the colonizers brought us the language, and according to the literature, we just adopted it. And what I'm going to talk about today is the ways in which globalization spread English around the world, but not globalization in the way that economists have been telling us about. Because according to many economists, globalization really started with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Iron Curtain. But globalization, as I'm going to tell you in a rather subversive way, started a long, long time ago, and it's been going on hand in hand with colonization. And I'm going to say a few things about that. And this is a byproduct of a course that I have been teaching at the University of Chicago for the past 15 years in alternate years, titled Language and Globalization. What is globalization? And the first thing that we want to remember is that globalization needn't be a worldwide phenomenon. It starts locally. And of course, it can become regional. And when some of the agents of globalization are successful, it can also become worldwide. In French, they have a way of avoiding ambiguity, although French linguists haven't always done a terrific job of it, because they have a specific word in French, mondialisation, which means the world. And when you speak of mondialisation, you can think of transportation, communication across the world. And when we speak of transportation, it's transportation of both goods and people. And these are important aspects of globalization. But the term globalisation in French strictly means total all-inclusiveness when, for instance, you speak of a global solution to a problem, okay? And when we speak of global conflicts are not necessarily worldwide conflicts and so forth. And of course, most of us are accustomed to what economists have told us over the past 20 years or so, something worldwide. And what we have to see in globalization is interdependencies in a complex system, okay? So where one point in a network connects with other points in a network, and when they are all interconnected, of course, they generate complexity. But that is one of the aspects of globalization, be it worldwide or in a different way, because at some point you discover it actually when there is a problem. And then you are trying to trace who is responsible. One thing that became very obvious to me from this perspective is several years ago, a new wing of Charles de Gaulle Airport, which was very fancy. It collapsed. It's in the form of a tube, and the whole tube came down. And the first thing people did was to look for the architect who was traveling in Japan. And he was very quick. Now that, you know, anybody can be sued for anything, he said, it's not me. My plan was, my design was terrific. Check the contractor. But how many contractors are there? And they are all involved in this global enterprise. The other case you may see For instance, I think it was in the 1980s when one of the space shuttles exploded right after launch. And then they discovered that about 900 companies had been involved in the manufacture of this. We just see NASA, but NASA contracts a lot of contractors to do the job. And this is when you understand globalization better, because you also find out that the different companies involved were not all American companies. Like Rolls-Royce was involved in the manufacture of the engine and things like that. Then you get a sense of what globalization means. We can even speak of local globalization to measure the extent to which an economic system is integrated. So in a city like Delhi, you can tell to what extent the economic system is integrated, like when sanitation service is operating well, the transportation service, the communication service, electricity, and all it takes is for one of these components to break down, and the system is paralyzed. For instance, if there were an epidemic and people couldn't go to work anymore because the sanitation service or the health system has failed the population, the city, that's a major problem and so forth. And the more modern a city is, the higher its globalization index, because you are going to find a number of interdependencies and so forth. And one of globalization index is a term that I have coined. I haven't seen it in the economics literature. But when we speak of worldwide globalization, one of the things we notice is that not everybody is equal. In that worldwide globalization, there are some nations that are considered to be at the center, and it's not India. India occupies an important place now as an emergent nation, member of the BRIC alliance. But the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, Japan, and so forth. And there are many countries in the third world that are in the periphery. And how do you notice this? Like in 2008, there was this financial crisis. All the nations at the center felt the impact of the crisis because they are more interconnected. And the countries in the periphery, it's just like nothing had happened because the world didn't change for them. Maybe there is so much misery all the time that it couldn't make any difference after all. So the whole world is not equally integrated in the worldwide globalization. And what happens is nations with a high globalization index occupy more central positions, while those with low globalization indexes remain in the periphery. And the other thing is that the kind of globalization that we see today is a more complex form of globalization that started much earlier in our history, and we can trace it to long-distance trade in antiquity. When people invented agriculture, had surpluses of goods, and had to sell these goods. But in order for that to work, they had to develop ways of preserving their products so that they wouldn't spoil before reaching the destination. They had to find a good transportation system. And a colleague of mine in France says the first highways in the world were rivers, and people had to use canoes and so forth to take the goods far away, but they had to have partners that had to exchange goods with them and so forth. So trade has been so central in this. And as things became more and more sophisticated by the time of the Hellenic Empire, which was primarily a kind of trade empire, we have good networks of globalization expanding around the world, and it took different kinds of people, like, for instance, the rise of Alexander the Great really expanded the Greek, the Hellenic trade world and took it all the way to Persia. And then the Romans came, and from the Roman Empire we learn all roads lead to Rome. And the roads are really the map of networks, of the big network that brought all the things that the Romans were interested in to Rome, while Rome traded its expertise with the world that it colonized in an interesting way. And what is also interesting about the Roman Empire is that it was not the kind of colonization that India, that Africa, and a number of places experienced. It's not the kind of colonization that the New World experienced either, because in the latest colonies of the past half millennium, you don't see members of people from the colonies rule the empire. And the Romans had a very nice technique of advising the local rulers, making them powerful, not really sending their soldiers to fight for them, but giving them military expertise, and they fought their own wars and so forth, but they had to pay tribute to Rome for that advice. And then they Romanized the local elite, and those that work well for Rome could also become emperors. That's the kind of thing that you don't see in the latest wave of colonization and so forth. But then when things were no longer beneficial to Rome, or when Rome was threatened, as we could see in history in the 5th century, when the Vandals and other populations were threatening Rome, the Romans abandoned the empire. But they left the legacy behind and so forth. And the economic system that they had developed, the urbanization model that they had introduced, the local rulers kept them. And they continue with that. And so that's a big legacy. And there too, you can find some of the ancestors of modern worldwide globalization. But when you speak of worldwide globalization, it depends on how much of the world you know. By that time, I think the Romans thought they knew everything about the world, well, except that they were receiving these goods from the Far East and so forth, and they knew there was another world out there, but they didn't know how far it went. But the Arabs, too, who stepped in around the Mediterranean after them, also had a vague idea of some world south of the Sahara Desert that they didn't know about, and they didn't know how far north Europe went and so forth. And the size of the world keeps growing, but that is also a function of the technology that people develop and how far the technology could take them. So the colonization of the world since the 15th century just expanded the geographic spread of globalization in a world in which the Chinese and the Arabs already had been engaged. There were different centers, the European center, the Arabs in the middle, in the 15th century. What we have to remember is that in the 15th century, when Western Europe actually, and it was not even Western Europe, because England was not a world as an important power yet in the 15th century. France was not. Holland was not. Only Portugal and Spain were the European powers at that time and the most important maritime powers, and they had just invented the caravel ship that could help them sail across the Atlantic, because the kinds of ships that had been used to sail across the Mediterranean were different, and there were no match for the kinds of waves that people could face in crossing the Atlantic. But also, there were no refrigerators at that time, people had to have good supply of water, fresh water, in order to cross the ocean. And the trip took more than 3 weeks, sometimes months. And they had to go in large fleets. So now they needed ships that could stock a lot of provisions in order for people to cross the sea, but also ships that could be much more stable at sea, and ships that could help them, that could make the expeditions more profitable. You are not just going to take a small size of goods and spend so much money in labor and equipment. That's not profitable. So that is what happened at that time. The map there is just to confuse you more because it represents the different nationalities that participated in them. So, and this is one of the times when you can say a map fools you really, because this map, which I had an artist produce for me, does not give you the dates. According to this map, it's like some pope had decided that the Portuguese would go to some territories, the Spaniards will go to some other territories, and the English and the French and the Dutch. I put it in terms of popes because popes messed with worldwide politics at that time. But it really depended on the strength that Iberia, and that is Portugal and Spain, had gained after 7 centuries of colonization by the Arabs. The Arabs, or the Muslims, their grip on Europe was weakening at that time, and the Iberians were looking for alternative ways of getting access to the spices, to silk, and all the things coming from the Orient that they had been getting through the Muslims or the Arabs that were actually engaged in the trade. And they couldn't dare use the same routes that the Arabs had used, because that would have continued the conflicts that they had had for 5 centuries or so before they felt strong enough to do otherwise. The Ottoman Empire was emerging as an important world power to contend with, and they didn't want to confront them where Turkey is and things like that. And the only other alternative was to go around the Atlantic. But then at that time, the compass, they had access to the compass invented in China. At that time, they had these new ships that they could trust, and they thought that they could sail west, which Christopher Columbus did. But they couldn't all go in the same direction because there were conflicts between Portugal, there was competition between Portugal and Spain. And so Portugal went around Africa, and Spain went westward, and the world was divided into, because you have 2 things there, 2 halves following a line going here along Cape Verde and then Brazil, which explains why Portugal got only this chunk. At that time, it was a smaller part of Brazil, not the size of Brazil today, because a pope, I think in 1475 or so, issued a bull at the Treaty of Tordesillas, saying Portugal will take the eastern half of the world, and Spain would take the western part of the world, and the western part of the world went all the way to the Philippines and things like that. So, and in this thing, the other thing is that Spain and Portugal had different perspectives on what to do with the colonies. Portugal thought that trade was going to be more lucrative, and indeed it did, because when you visit Portugal today, you will find legacies of that trade. Portugal had not always been a poor country. Portugal was a world power for 2 centuries before it was destituted by other European nations. And Spain thought it would be more advantageous to settle the colonies rather than just trade with them. And so we have the Hispanicization of Latin America that you can see today, even through the complexion of people and so forth, and they discover all these gold mines and so forth, and they benefited a lot from that before becoming also a medium-sized country in the modern world, economically speaking. So this is the picture of globalization that you get today. If you look at the explorations at that time, actually, I compare it sometimes to space explorations today. The part that Russia is playing, the part that the United States is playing, the part that the European Union is playing, and so forth. I think Depeche, one of my colleagues at the University of Chicago, I heard him last year at the University of Chicago Center in Paris talk about the possibility of people talking about the interplanetary world in the future rather than talking about globalization, because globalization is becoming the passé. So these are some of the things that we have to keep in perspective. But speaking of Arabs and Chinese, the Arabs knew the world between the Mediterranean and all the way to China. First, there is the Silk Road. The Silk Road actually involves several intermediaries. Not the Chinese didn't come all the way to the Mediterranean. They sold to some people, and the other people took the goods, the silk, and took it with them. The Arabs knew the route from the Red Sea all the way to the Pacific. They knew the Indian Ocean very well. Actually, the Portuguese got help from the Arabs, seamen, in order to come to the Far East, because the Arab seamen knew about the monsoon seasons, and they knew what time of the year to sail east and what time of the year to sail west. And if you went against the trend, you were going to have shipwrecks. So these are the kinds of things that the history of colonization doesn't usually tell us about, but when you go and dig in the literature, you learn all this. And so it's a history of globalization where, like in science, everybody steps on somebody else's shoulder and makes progress and so forth. So it was not all conflict and wars and so forth. Much happened in the meantime. Another form of globalization, we find it in the Hanseatic League, I think from the 13th to the 17th century in Europe. And the Hanseatic League, I tend to consider it now as a precursor of the European Union. People used Latin at that time as the language of bookkeeping, not necessarily the language of trade. And it was not classical Latin, it was vulgar Latin. But as you know, vulgar Latin is really what became the world language, or a set of world languages, because it's through Roman-style cities that developed actually after the Romans had left, and trade, that Latin really spread. Not through scholars, because as we know, the Latin used by scholars didn't go very far, but it's the Latin associated with grassroots economy that spread and became the Romance languages. And what do we know? French and Spanish in particular are also among the world languages today, okay? And so when in the 17th century the English were up to facing Portugal and Spain in the venture of colonization, because the Pope had already divided the world into two hemispheres. Now they had to fight the Portuguese and the Spaniards in order to get colonies in the same areas. And at that time, they didn't really care very much about Africa. Well, it's not by accident. When you read the work of Jared Diamond, for instance, Guns, Germs, and Steel, one of the things you're going to find there is that in terms of vegetation, climate, and so forth, according to him, Africa was dealt a bad hand of cards. A lot of the plants that you can cultivate industrially elsewhere, you cannot grow them in Africa. In terms of animal domestication, it's not the same kinds of animals. Like, people wonder why Africans didn't domesticate the zebra. The zebra, although it looks like a horse, is a different animal genetically. People have wondered why Africans didn't domesticate the elephant in the same way that Indians have. Well, the African elephant is different genetically from the Indian elephant and things like that. And so climatically, it's not by accident that only Algeria and South Africa were colonized on the settlement model, because that's where you find climates that are similar to European climates, and you can grow some of the vegetation and so forth. And the rest of Africa, especially in the rainforest, rain actually impoverishes the soil because it's heavy rain and it drives things down deep in the ground and not at the level where you can grow some of the plants and things like that. So Africa became interesting to Europeans mostly after the Industrial Revolution, because now they discovered they could grow like rubber, they could grow palm oil and those kinds of things, which are tropical things. But also, especially, there are all these mines that people discovered in Africa, and those are raw materials that the Industrial Revolution in Europe needed and so forth. But in Asia, which became an interesting concern, there were the spices, but not just the spices, because the Indians, for instance, were trading gold, and they wanted to get hold of that gold and get control of it, and these kinds of things. And initially, as I was reading the literature recently, it seems that in the 17th century, the English were not as strong as, say, so we have the East India Company, but it was weaker compared to the French East India Company or Dutch East India Company and so forth. It would take a while, and when you read that history, the Dutch got hold of Indonesia from the Portuguese before the English actually got hold of India and could control it. And the French got hold of the French Indochina before the English could really have good control of India. And it will take up to the 18th century before the English really have good control of India. And by the time the early 19th century, we have Thomas Macaulay Minute on the Education of the Indians. And so things become more complex at that time from the point of view of language spread. Although the Portuguese lost most of their trade colonies to the Dutch, the French, and the English in the 17th century, Portuguese actually remained the lingua franca of trade and diplomacy all the way to Japan. From the coast of West Africa all the way to Japan, it was Portuguese. The French boast of having had French as the world language for centuries before English became a world language. Well, the French had English as the French had French as an important world language on the model of classical Latin among European scholars. It was the elite of the court that were interested in French. The rest of the people didn't do business in French, whereas Portuguese people use it to actually trade around the world. And it's only in the 18th century that little by little Portuguese would be replaced by English. The English won't prevail as the foremost colonial power until the 19th century. By the time of the Industrial Revolution, they had secured India while the Dutch kept Indonesia, and the French were struggling to control the French Indochina. They gained Australia as a penal settlement colony while losing the United States, and they had confiscated numerous French and Spanish Caribbean colonies. So that gave English a momentum to the extent that the English come with a new attitude. They impose their language. They don't want to learn the local language. At the time of the Portuguese, when they ruled, they actually managed to deal with the local people, the indigenous populations in their own languages and so forth. I'm trying to stay away from something that I have a weakness for, to tell people, listen, pigeons didn't develop as soon as the Europeans came in contact with non-Europeans. Pigeons actually emerged later in the late 18th century, I think, rather than in the beginning, and pigeons never evolved before creoles and things like that, all these things that some students of linguistics have been reading in textbooks. But that is what has informed part of what I'm presenting here. The 19th century would bring the English numerous colonies in Africa. They would even colonize the Dutch in South Africa. And so South Africa is an interesting case of colonization. Actually, if you read about the Shaka Zulu episode, this is one case where Africans were colonizing the southern tip of Africa when Europeans were also trying to colonize it, and they clashed. So you can speak of Bantu colonization of South Africa, then the Dutch colonization of South Africa since the 17th century, then the English or British colonization of South Africa, which would lead to the Boers War and so forth from the late 18th century onwards. So that's really an interesting place to study the spread of European languages. A huge British empire was now emerging, which constituted an important globalized economic network. Even without the United States, the empire emerged as an important chunk of a globalized economic network dominated by Europe that used English as either a vernacular, that is mother tongue, the language that you use for day-to-day communication, or as a lingua franca, you keep your language, but you need it to do business. In some places around the Atlantic, English even produced creoles associated with plantation slave colonies, whereas various English pidgins emerged in the Pacific trade and plantation colonies using Polynesian and other contract laborers. And if you remember your history, the British colonized the Pacific mostly in the 19th century. And what is also interesting is that I have been surveying different pidgins around the world and identifying the pidgins that have been lexified by European languages. English stands out. I can't find Portuguese pidgins. And anything called a French pidgin dates from the 20th century. One of them is an artificial one concocted by the French themselves, Français tirailleurs, because they thought that Africans were not intelligent enough to learn the sophisticated language that French is, and so they concocted this artificial language that the Africans were incapable of learning anyway because it is too illogical. And the other one is associated with Vietnam toward the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. It's called Thai boy. It didn't survive. Okay. And it suggests that the English had a particular way of interacting with people that led to the emergence of these pidgins, and this is something that we have to understand. And I'm keeping creoles and pidgins in the picture because when people count speakers of English around the world, they also count speakers of English creoles and English pidgins, which inflates the numbers. Okay? It's like the whole more than 1 billion Indian population counts as Anglophone when you have to count the number of speakers of English around the world, although reality suggests that probably at best 40% of the Indian population can communicate in English. Okay? And the British Empire evolved later on into the British Commonwealth with English taught for indigenous colonial auxiliaries, and this is the spirit of Thomas Macaulay, famous minute of 1835 on on Indian education, because when you read the minute, it's actually an elaborate minute. It says, the goal is not to make all Indians English speakers, but to create a class of Indians that would help England colonize India, and these people would function as intermediaries between the majority of Indians about whom they didn't care very much about, because colonization was in the interest of the UK and not in the interest of India. And these colonial auxiliaries, as you follow history, some of them were used in the colonization of the world east of India. Okay. And the geographical expansion of the United States, especially after the Louisiana Purchase, made the Anglophone world much bigger, even more significantly with the addition of its dominions. What happens? When the United States became independent, there were 13 coastal colonies. But they couldn't move westward easily because the French had secured the territory going from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to Quebec. So along the Missouri River and all the way to the Rocky Mountains, and they were a barrier. And with the Napoleonic Wars, France was weakened. They needed a lot of money. By the early 19th century, the Haitian Revolution was happening, and Haiti had been an important source of money, of income for France. Haiti was the world's greatest producer of sugar by the time of the Haitian Revolution. Now, I think that purchase is described as the cheapest, the most inexpensive property purchase in the world. So when the United States bought the territory that constituted the Louisiana colony, not the modern Louisiana state of Louisiana, but all the territory from the Gulf of Mexico to Quebec, it opened the way for the westward expansion of the United States. And from the point of view of language expansion, it was a great loss for France in the competition between the two languages that were spreading in the colonies. So this kind of globalization, combined with the kind of economic power that the United States was going to become, really changed things significantly for English. So several events from the 19th century to the mid-20th century contributed to making English the dominant lingua franca of the world, and to associating it with worldwide economic and political globalization, though it is not the language with the most vernacular speakers. So this is important when you count languages that have the most speakers, actual speakers. They are Mandarin, Hindi, Spanish before English, and not English. But when you count the number of people that use English not only as a mother tongue or as a vernacular, but also as a lingua franca, then you get different kinds of numbers. So that's why even though there is a huge Chinese diaspora in the world, because Chinese is used primarily as a vernacular in the diaspora, it makes no difference. Although there is a huge Indian diaspora in the world, because Hindi or Urdu or Bhojpuri are used mostly within the ethnic group, that doesn't make any difference. It's the extent to which the economy or businesses empower a particular language, and that is what contributes to making a language a world language, and that is how globalization has helped English. And the weakening of Europe by 2 world wars and the dependence of Western Europe on the United States to rebuild itself economically, that gave an important advantage to English. I think the treaty to end the First World War, as I remember, it shocked the French because it was signed not only in French but also in English. And the French didn't expect that because the American president insisted that the treaty be also signed in English. And the emergence of both the US and the UK as leaders in science and technology, which the rest of the world wants to emulate. Everybody wants to go to do a postdoc in the United States and so forth. That gives a lot of power to English. All of us that left a francophone country or lusophone country to go and study in the United States, we are the people spreading English around the world. It's not the native speakers of English that are doing the job, and it is very important because we stand as models for success to those people from our respective countries where other languages are spoken, and they find it in us an incentive to learn English as the other language that may bring you economic success. The emergence of the British Commonwealth as an important economic bloc and the quick economic recovery of the UK, this also played an important role, because it doesn't matter that the proportion that only a minority of people speak English fluently in India to the rest of the world. To Japan, for instance, India is an Anglophone country. More motivation for Japanese to learn English because it's the buyer's language or it's the partner's language in the trade that matters in this particular case. The foundation of the United Nations and the selection of New York as its headquarters favored English as its preeminent lingua franca. Although people say you have to use Chinese too and so forth, how many representatives at the United Nations bother being fluent in Mandarin? Everybody is worried about being fluent in English. And even at the European Union, it's the same story. And the French are miserable about this. But English is prevailing, even when England is only half a foot in the European Union and this doesn't participate in all the activities of the European Union. What an advantage. The fact that the rest of the world wants to sell to the US and the British Commonwealth is the biased language that speaks. The British Council and the American language institutes around the world are only responding to the demand on the market. They are not forcing people to learn the language and so forth, which has often been misunderstood. You read the work of Robert Phillipson, for instance. It's like the British Council is pouring so much money into converting everybody into an English speaker. It's not quite the story. It's the law of demand and offer. You put it that way, and then you understand what is going on. Spanish and Mandarin may have more native speakers, but the countries speaking them had or have weak buying power. And Hindi has taken a back seat to English in India, which doesn't help the matter. So it's all in favor of English. And when you look at this map that I took from a French magazine in 2005, you look at the direction of the arrows and see how many fat arrows are going to the United States. The only fat center is in Europe, but that is the whole European Union. Many countries as opposed to what the United States is. And that's very influential. And if in the European center you also abstract the UK, there's also a big chunk that goes for the Anglophone world and so forth. So that's quite interesting. Are there precedents for this kind of history? Well, the Greek once prevailed as the language of scholarship until it was replaced by Latin in Western Europe and by Arabic in the Muslim world, and it spread through trade routes of the Hellenic trade empire. Latin prevailed for long in the former Western Roman Empire, having followed the routes of the Roman military and trade expeditions. Latin was also aided by the success of the Roman style of urbanization, business, and government. Okay. Portuguese was aided by the success of Portugal with its trade colonies until the 18th century. And the Arabs and the Chinese actually proceeded differently because they preferred to trade in the buyer's language, in the partner's language. And they are not the only people that did this. There must have been advantages. If you go to places like Singapore and Malaysia, there is this particular breed of Chinese called Peranakans. They are the counterpart of Creole populations in the Caribbean, because these are the Chinese that married into the local populations and created their own new culture that is a combination of Chinese and Malaysian culture. There's a special cuisine in the area called Nyonya cuisine that is a nice blend of Malaysian and Chinese traditions, and you get a picture of that. Okay. Because after like the Chinese and the Arabs, the Dutch did the same, and Dutch didn't really expand into world language because of that. And people have been saying that Dutch didn't really want to share their language with the subjugated populations. Maybe a better way of controlling them, I don't know. The English managed to control the colonized populations very well in teaching them their language too. So these things are tricky. We never know the full story. The central position of the United States and the United Kingdom, along with the rest of the British Commonwealth in the new worldwide globalization, made English the preeminent world lingua franca it is. The collapse of the Soviet Union was more free publicity for Anglo-Saxon capitalism associated foremost with English. Sometimes you get support from the failure of the competitor. So the Soviet Union was not, I mean, it was very successful militarily, but terrible economically. And the people need money in their pockets. They need bread for a table and so forth. What happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of those countries that had been dominated by Russia wanted to give up Russian and learn English instead and so forth. English is taught and learned in every country in the world as an official or foreign language if it is not a mother tongue. Faster communication and transportation and easier mobility of population movements have made made English more attractive, especially with the United States and the United Kingdom playing a central role in the development of technology. But not all English speakers have the same status nor authority on their language, Braj Kachru, a native of India, has proposed a concentric categorization of speakers of English around the world in 3 categories. The inner circle consisting of speakers of so-called native Englishes, that is in the UK and former settlement colonies, that includes the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And then the outer circle, speakers of so-called indigenized Englishes in former exploitation colonies like India, like Ghana, like Nigeria, where English is the or an official language and is used as an elite lingua franca within the nation. And an expanding circle, this has grown especially since the Second World War, where there are speakers of English who learn English as a foreign language for communication with outsiders. So the Japanese learn English, but when you are in Japan, the Japanese don't talk to each other in English. When you are in India, you can see Indians talk to each other in English, and these are different kinds of scenarios. Okay. And there is well-justified advocacy for treating indigenized Englishes as legitimate varieties on a par with, say, American and Australian Englishes. After all, they have contributed to making English strong in the new globalized world, and strong especially demographically. There is also advocacy for legitimizing English as a lingua franca with a norm coming from outside the inner circle. The question is what that norm might be, what purpose it would serve. It's like thinking that Japan and the Democratic Republic of Congo, people speaking English with different kinds of accents, are going to get together and develop a norm. And it is pointless, because the point of these people learning English is to communicate with the Anglophone world. It's a different question for India or for Ghana or for Nigeria, because where English has indigenized and has become part of the national linguascape, it is quite normal for people to develop their own norm. American English is very much respected today in the world. About 60 or 70 years ago, people were laughing at American English as a bastard variety of English and so forth. And you see what economic power can do now that India is emerging as a so-called emergent nation economically. It can also make a big difference. Otherwise, we are witnessing a normal case of global language spread and its differential evolution, just the kind of thing that happened to Latin. That kind of language wins a Pyrrhic victory because it is influenced by the languages previously spoken by the populations appropriating it, and it differentiates in the process. Is English a killer language par excellence? I had to bring this up because linguists are very much worried that we are losing linguistic diversity around the world, that English is displacing a host of other languages wherever it goes. Well, it's a kind of embarrassment for linguistics because the history of the world has not been uniform. What has happened in former settlement colonies, such as the United States and Australia, is not happening in former exploitation colonies, such as India and Nigeria, and certainly not in countries of the expanding circle, because in the expanding circle, what difference does it make if you learn English or French or Spanish or Mandarin to connect with the rest of the world? In former settlement colonies, it's another story. When you don't communicate in English in the United States, you are more or less a lost case. because you are not competitive within the socioeconomic structure. And after you learn English, if you are accepted in the dominant socioeconomic structure, then the other language becomes superfluous. When you are in India and you master English, you probably still have relatives who don't master English, and you don't sever your kinship ties with them. And you have to stay fluent in Hindi, Urdu, or whatever other language is associated with your ethnic background, and that heritage makes a lot of sense. And I think that in local politics, it makes sense if you are fluent in that heritage language. So the investments in the heritage languages are not the same in settlement colonies as in former exploitation colonies. And these are important questions. To begin with, languages have no agency of their own and do not wage wars with each other. So the term killer language is a poorly chosen term. They do not spread on their own. Speakers spread them by adopting them. And as given the example that I have given you, it's not like genes. If you have these dominant genes, then the recessive features of some other genes don't show up. They may manifest themselves generations later, but not in you. In language, you can pile up languages because this is learned behavior, and you can remain fluent in more than one language if the social ecology favors that. And so it's a different story. We really have to look into population structure. Although English has spread at the expense of other languages in former English settlement colonies, and this includes other European languages, the story is not the same in former exploitation and trade colonies, especially when the expanded pidgins of the Pacific don't even count as English dialects, according to most linguists. So what you get is more languages emerging rather than languages disappearing. However, I must add, in the Pacific, people are saying now that the English pidgins are threatening some of the ancestral languages because pidgins are associated with modernity. Okay, and these are things to remember. Many languages are still safe from the geographical expansion of English, especially in the periphery of the new globalized world. The spread of English is not repeating that of Latin literally, although there are similarities. Even Latin didn't have a uniform history in its spread. Okay. So that's the end of what I had to talk to you about. Thank you very much for your attention.